The question is, who are the winners and losers from the perspective of Republicans, understanding that your views, especially on this issue, might not entirely or closely align with a majority of Republican voters, a supermajority of Republican voters, and a majority of voters overall with respect to Ukraine. Vivek stood out in large part the other night because he was the only one willing to say that I want to stop funding to Ukraine. Now, I would argue he wants to fund wars with China and Taiwan. He wants to send the military to the Mexican border and invade Mexico. There is no evidence that he has been supportive of domestic spending, even though the idea, the concept of shifting foreign aid, for military spending to domestic spending is alluded to, but is there any evidence they would actually do it? I have all of those criticisms. But at the end of the day, if no one else is even willing to match him rhetorically on the bare minimum of, I think that we should be focusing more at home than overseas, he's a clear winner. Why do you think that nobody else in that debate stage, with the possible exception of Ron DeSantis, who kind of halfway did one of those half hand raises when asked about whether or not he would withdraw aid from Ukraine, is willing to take him on that point?
It's not a territorial dispute either. As President of the United States, your first obligation is to defend our country and its people. And that means you're sending all this money, but you're not doing what we need to do to secure our own border. We have tens of thousands of people who are being killed because we're not handling both. And so I am going to declare it a national emergency. I'm not going to send troops to Ukraine, but I am going to send them to our southern border. When these drug pushers are bringing fentanyl across the border, that's going to be the last thing they do. We're going to use force, and we're going to leave them stone cold dead.
I mean, yeah, I think his criticism of neoconservatism is probably pretty fair in terms of how neocons traditionally view the United States and our role internationally. And I would suppose one could make a moral and maybe even an ethical argument for why there may be some soundness to their disposition. With that said, though, I think it's why Donald Trump has been so successful. I think about Donald Trump in terms of his position on NATO. I think about Trump in terms of relations with Mexico and trade there, trade with China, et cetera. So I think Vivek is certainly tapping into a sentiment that exists not only within the party, but within the American populace, generally speaking. But where are those votes going to come from in terms of electability? I don't think Trump voters are going to leave Trump for Vivek Ramaswamy. And so I believe from a political position, he's seeing a moment. They will applaud him. They'll pat him on the back. But once Trump really gets back into this thing, they're going to stick with their guy.
Yeah, so I do think that's the fundamental problem with Vivek, that his choice to say things like Donald Trump is the best president of the 21st century.
I'd like to get in and respond. Let's just speak the truth, okay? President Trump, I believe, was the best president of the 21st century. It's a fact.
Aligning himself so closely with him from a political perspective, if there's no room between you, and Trump is very much alive and still running and leading the race by 40-some points, what is the point of you? And if this is just a campaign for VP, then maybe this is going to be effective. Maybe this will work. But ultimately, what is the point of you? And that is, if he ever wants to break away and actually win this race, then I think that the trajectory that he's taking is not the right one, which brings us to some of these other candidates in the field. Mm-hmm. As much as there has been discussion about Vivek Ramaswamy, my feeling was that in terms of the biggest gap, the unexpected gain, the gap between what was expected of their performance and how they actually performed was Nikki Haley.
Yeah.
Who very much, I think, surprised people in terms of her confidence, her poise, her sense of professionalism and expertise, which I will say a lot of the Republican candidates, the Mike Pence style candidates, even Chris Christie, they were angry at Vivek and they characterized him as kind of a young upstart who didn't have any experience and they didn't have a sense of tradition, which is exactly why people like him, that he's not going to do the same thing the old guard establishment Republican
young,
Party
fresh,
said.
Different ideas. Absolutely. That resonates with people.
However, I think Nikki Haley revealed, I wouldn't call it establishment experience, but revealed that I think there is some value in someone who just seems knowledgeable, whose experience is not about doing doing things the way that they've always been done, but is about having a sense of how things get done, how to talk, how to present things to the American public. And she came off as very mature and kind of confidence inspiring from my perspective. What did you make of her?
No, I agree 100%. I thought she did very, very well. I mean, I've had a chance to get to know the governor, oh gosh, for a couple of years now, going all the way back to the 2016 presidential race when Dr. Carson was in. I was on his campaign before he endorsed former President Trump. And then clearly we went on that bandwagon. And I have a lot of respect for her. I know a lot of friends who are Democrats out from South Carolina. They have a lot of respect for her. Many of them worked with her. They thought she was a very competent leader, someone who showcased curiosity about a plethora of things, open to different ideas, open to learning, willing to admit what she didn't know, and willing to even acknowledge when she made mistakes. And I think those things are important for a leader. We have enough egos and egoism in politics, I think. But you know, one thing, Brianna, that really stood out to me for Nikki, and I thought this was her best moment of the night, is when she was talking about abortion.
When it comes to a federal ban, let's be honest with the American people and say it will take 60 Senate votes. It will take a majority of the House. So in order to do that, let's find consensus. Can't we all agree that we should ban late-term abortions? Can't we all agree that we should encourage adoptions? Can't we all agree that doctors and nurses who don't believe in abortion shouldn't have to perform them? Can't we all agree that contraception should be available? And can't we all agree that we are not going to put a woman in jail or give her the death penalty if she gets an abortion? Let's treat this like a respectful issue that it is and humanize the situation and stop demonizing the situation.
Republicans have been pummeled over this issue of abortion. I mean, I think about Wisconsin with Janet Protasewicz, who won the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court seat. I don't know if you followed that closely. I think about states like I believe it was either Kansas or Arkansas, where like 80% of counties that voted for Trump went with Democratic counties saying we don't want further restrictions on abortions. And so I think she hit the right tone on that particular issue, because it is one that will cause Republicans to lose over and over and over again. And I think it's because Republicans never thought about this in terms of the evangelicals. Okay, once the Supreme Court accomplishes this and sends it back to the states, then what? I mean, honestly, what's the political appetite for restrictions over people's personal decisions with their physicians? And one could even say, and I have my views on abortion. I'm a Christian conservative. It's not something that I necessarily agree with, but I'm also a conservative who believes in limited government. And so, Brianna, you sort of have to raise this question, which presents an interesting dichotomy. What are the actual limitations of government? Do we want government when it's for our interests, but not when it's against our interest? I mean, I believe in not being hypocritical here. And I think that's a legitimate critique and criticism among many conservatives that we on the conservative side are really going to have to wrestle with over time.
Yeah, that was a fascinating colloquy for a couple of reasons. One, Nikki Haley acknowledging the political L that abortion is for the right, but having the savvy to kind of frame it as, this isn't really about what I want. At the end of the day, we don't have 60 senators who are going to vote for a 6-week abortion ban. So let's focus on the things that we can agree as a community on, late-term abortions, whatever. And I have substantive disagreements with her about how she framed a lot of that, obviously. But just from a political perspective, that felt very smart. But to your point, it was interesting to see how everyone else handled that, because she came off as mature, leveling with the public, and not a crazy right-winger to the majority of folks who, as you point out, actually do want to have some abortion rights. Mike Pence very predictably came back and said, well, I don't think this is a political issue. I think it's a moral issue. I'm a Christian conservative, and I don't think anybody should have the right to choose. That's his lane. No one expects anything different of him. It's not popular. He doesn't care that it's not popular. God bless. That's his journey.
Can't we have a minimum standard in every state in the nation that says when a baby is capable of feeling pain, an abortion cannot be allowed? A 15-week ban is an idea whose time has come. It's supported by 70% of the American people, but it's going to take unapologetic leadership that stands on principle and expresses compassion for women in crisis pregnancies. I'll do that as president of the United States.
But then Mike DeSantis came in and kind of gave a similar sort of line, saying this isn't about throwing it to the states. This is a moral issue. I signed a 6-week abortion ban in Florida and I still won. So this doesn't matter to me.
You got to do what you think is right. I believe in a culture of life. I was proud to sign the heartbeat bill. I remember one of the most impactful moments of my life was when I heard the heartbeat of my oldest daughter in my wife's womb, and then saw the sonograms of all three of my kids. What the Democrats are trying to do on this issue is wrong, to allow abortion all the way up to the moment of birth.
Which, I mean,
yeah, he signed that after he was reelected, though, which I'm surprised no one called him out on that. It was literally
I didn't
like
realize
this year. It was this year, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was this year that he signed that 6-week ban, like only a couple months ago. So it's like, dude, you're not being completely transparent with the American people.
Incredible. And then the most interesting part, weirdly enough, was that Doug Burgum, who exactly, had a kind of interesting little moment where he said exactly what you said, which is he foregrounded and seemed to express a principled view of what Republicans often say, but often don't follow through on, which is that I actually do believe these things should be thrown to the states. And he pulled out his little pocket constitution and said the 10th Amendment says that the state should be able to decide these kinds of things. And I don't support a federal abortion ban because I actually believe in federalism the way that Republican Party is supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think that it was a good moment for him? Do you think that it moves the needle for him at all?
Well, no, but it was a good moment. It was an accurate moment, right? I mean, yeah, my undergraduate degree is in political theory. He was in sync with what Edmund Burke wrote about, what Robert Nozick discussed, what Michael Oakeshott wrote about, what the late Sir Edwin wrote about out of Britain. I mean, if you look at the level of inconsistencies ideologically, even on the left as well, let's be honest about it. It's really non-existent. And I have at least tried my best to be as pure as I possibly can. And I'm a human being. I have my flaws. I have my inconsistencies and idiosyncrasies, et cetera, like everybody else. But I do take myself to task and say, well, wait a minute here. Yes, this is your belief. Yes, you do not think this is wrong. But should I use compulsory force to dictate or mandate upon others what I don't necessarily agree with? No. Now, does that mean that I don't have the opportunity to present the case and say, hey, I think there's a better way? And maybe to try to provide an environment that exists that allows for people to make better decisions that I think are more in sync with my moral values. But I just have a hard time being someone who is extremely pro-limited government, but only for the things that are important to me. And everything else, I just want to use government to say, well, it's going to be Shermichael's Way or the highway. I think people look at that stuff around and they say, you guys are a bunch of liars. You're a bunch of snakes in the grass. And I think that's how a lot of American people perceive some of the positions. So for Doug, I think he was right in terms of federalism. But I think the current makeup of the Republican Party in terms of populism, nationalism, and even, I guess you could say, Christianity, that whole makeup, I just don't think is in sync with where he is.
Does the fact that it does seem like even conservatives, many conservatives, are backing away from a Ron DeSantis style politics, specifically on this issue, where his vendetta against Walt Disney, weaponizing the power of the state against a particular company because he doesn't believe in the values that they've articulated for themselves as a business. Some of the battles over school curriculum where it has gone from, let's take this book out of schools that seems too sexual, let's say, to let's ban literature that is for many years perceived to be some of the best of American literature, and let's ban entire disciplines of study because they're Black study, things like that, which seem to be pushing the fulcrum to, I want you to have your choice, to you're going to have my choice. It does seem like there's enough Republicans that are upset about that, who have even he started to back away from the Disney issue, that it shows the limits. It shows the limits of that kind of politics, or at least it shows how effective Republicans have been at explaining the values of federalism to Americans so that everyone across the political board basically is uncomfortable with the idea of the state enforcing so explicitly its values on the public.
Explicitly and aggressively, right? But let's be honest, it's been a very aggressive process. I mean, I don't know if you saw the interview, I think a week or 2 weeks ago, when Ron DeSantis said, well, I'm not really focused on Disney anymore. I've moved beyond that. I've moved, that's old news. And now Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, is now suing the state of Florida. So like, no, dude, this is not over.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them for doing so, by the way. But I think when you look at the polling data on how most Republican voters or GOP leaning voters view DeSantis's feud with Disney, they don't agree with it. Mm-hmm. The government, whether it's state government or federal government, has zero business telling a private entity how it can or should not operate. Yeah. At least not without some level of restriction, because like we don't want people taking advantage of folks or having kids underage working. I mean, we clearly have some limitations there, right? And restrictions. And most people, generally speaking, agree to that. Yeah. But DeSantis took it way too far. And I think he realized that as he started to really campaign more and more and is slowly trying to walk it back. But I think in the minds of many Americans, it makes them nervous about a DeSantis presidency, even conservatives. I mean, I'm a conservative. I don't think it's the government's business, if I were a small business owner, to dictate to me how I should run my business. That's not your business. Now, in terms of the school issue that you raised, I think most of us generally would agree that sexual material should not be readily available to younger kids. I don't think there's a sane person who would disagree with that. But to your other point, on some of the other more historic pieces of art, I like to refer to them as art. Pieces such as what's her name? 11. That's one. Dr. King. All of these different books, and there's so many of them that I'm just sort of forgetting. So to the audience, please forgive me. It's been a while since I've had to really memorize some of this stuff. But the point that I'm trying to make is this. When you have any person that can call into a school district and say, well, I'm concerned about this particular book, the district then in turn have to take the book out, and it goes through this ridiculous process to only put the book back in is nonsensical to me. You look at this entire debate and argument that we've had about Black studies, for example. And this is an issue, and I don't know if we're going to get into this or not, but this is why a lot of people of color, specifically Black Americans, view the Republican Party as not being forward thinking or open on issues of race because of decisions like which we've seen out of Florida. Texas is another example. And so I think, Brianna, we have to parse through these things. The sexual material, I'm absolutely against for young kids. I think most people are. But when it comes to some of these other arts, pieces of art, these writings, that is, I think most of us should say kids should have access to different ideas. Or I don't want to say kids. Let me be clear on this. Younger people, middle school, high school, should have access to different writings that may challenge their thought process. That is a part of learning. We want individuals who have a broad approach to thinking and not people who are sort of cookie cutter, because I don't think that's what the rest of the world is doing, which is why the United States is like 30, 31 in terms of education for the developed world. So this is an important point. I just want to caveat that I think the problem with the sexual materials, while superficially I might say I agree, it's very subjective what constitutes a sexual material. That's so when I was a little kid, my parents were teachers, so I used to get to school early because I'd drive in with them, obviously. And I'd wait in the library and read in the mornings. So I very quickly exhausted all of my age level books. And I remember being a kid, I don't know, early middle school maybe, and going into the older book section, finding some of those more adult Judy Blume books where they're teenagers and they're hooking up during the summer and they're, and I loved. Let me tell you, I thought it was like salacious and I loved it. It wasn't porn, it was Judy Blume at the end of the day. But there are people who would say there was a book about a teenage girl losing her virginity in the library and 11-year-old Brianna shouldn't have been reading it and we're going to ban Judy Blume. I mean, there are definitely people who would say that. So that's a very subjective view. However, coming back to the race stuff, which I think I agree with you, it feels very targeted. It feels explicitly racist when you're saying you're going to ban African-American studies, but not East Asian studies or European history or other kinds of history that are not like mainstream, whatever you want to call American history. And it is curious to me for that reason that Vivek Ramaswamy has chosen the lane that he's chosen. One moment during the campaign, during the debate, stuck with me in particular, and I haven't really heard it discussed very much. And it was this moment where he talks about his parents having immigrated from India with no money in their pocket, no money in their pocket, but having been able to achieve the American dream.
I'll tell you, I'm not a politician, Brett. You're right about that. I'm an entrepreneur. My parents came to this country with no money 40 years ago. I have gone on to found multi-billion-dollar companies. I did it while marrying my wife, Apurva, raising our 2 sons, following our faith in God. That is the American dream. And I am genuinely worried that that American dream will not exist for our two sons and their generation unless we do something about it. And I do think, Brett, is going to take an outsider, because for a long time we have professional politicians in the Republican Party who have been running from something. Now is our moment to start running to something.
And this is wielded as evidence of the fact that America is great, anybody can make it here, and tacitly anybody who has not made it here has failed because of their own moral, intellectual ineptitude. And the implicit in that is that therefore the government shouldn't be working to help any of those people because America is already great. Now, a quick glance at Vivek Ramaswamy's Wikipedia reveals that his mother is a doctor, his father was an engineer, they had elite educations in India, they belonged to an elite caste in India, they immigrated here as professionals, and not the kind of story of, I'm a doctor, but they don't value my degree. They don't honor my degree, so I had to drive a cab. His parents weren't those people. They came here as professionals and worked as professionals in the United States of America. And in fact, his mother, as a doctor, was instrumental in his personal business success. I won't get into it here, but he basically earned this money in the biopharmaceutical industry by buying a drug that had failed. His mother was one of the doctors that basically put out a new study on the drug, suggesting that it had better applications, that it had not in fact failed, which helped to drive up the stock, which they held for a while and then sold before the cliff when they realized the drug was in fact a dud. And that's part of how he made his money, was a little bit scammy, but never mind all of that. The point is that his mother was a professional, writing papers, working for hospitals, et cetera. I think a geriatric psychiatrist was her background, and it was an Alzheimer's drug. Okay. So what does it mean? For me as a Black American, I got to say, I was disturbed by the implication that someone could obviously enjoy the benefits of being an American, which I agree are good and should be preserved and expanded upon. Mm-hmm. At the same time that they have a policy prescription that would limit the rights to the franchise for people under 25, that would create literacy, a version of a literacy test, which our ancestors fought very hard not to be subject to, which was an explicit program to try to prevent Black people from being able to vote and have equal rights in this country. And to do that while all at the same time positioning himself as a young, diverse person on the stage who literally plagiarizes Barack Obama's opening line in the 2008 debates as he's introducing himself to the American public.
Who the heck is this skinny guy with a funny last name, and what the heck is he doing in the middle of this debate stage?
The hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too.
Do you see what I'm getting at? Like, there's a kind of perverse pulling the ladder up behind me kind of attitude that he has. That I know this is my personal bugaboo, but I find it to be deeply angry-making.
I mean, look, again, this goes to the point that I'm saying here. I think the United States does indeed present one of the best and greatest opportunities of upward mobility in the world. Now, there are some countries, Western countries, that are better in certain regards. But I think by most metrics, I think we provide the greatest opportunity for people. I believe that. But I also recognize that not everyone is going to have the same work ethic. Not everyone's going to have the same opportunity, same access, et cetera. And that's why we do have social programs. Now, as someone who spent a lot of time in politics on the electoral side and the legislative side, I think it's our responsibility as legislators and those of us who support legislators to make the best decisions to design legislation that fosters the greatest environment for economic upward mobility is key to get access to everything else. But I also understand mathematical probability theory tells us that there will always still be a percent of people who just will not make it. And we need to have an environment to support those individuals. And so, maybe some conservatives may disagree with me on that, but I don't believe in talking down the people because they haven't had the same amount of success that I have or access that I have. Sometimes there are cases where people just didn't do what they needed to do. We got to be honest about that. But I don't think that you can cascade everybody as being in that particular position.
So, but then the question is, what is he doing from a policy prescription perspective? So, for instance, Jeff Stein over at Washington Post pointed out that when asked about education, the only prescription for education that anybody on that stage gave was to cancel the Department of Education. Now, Jeff Stein pointed out that the yearly funding for the Department of Education is about $80 billion. I think Vivek specifically said he wanted to disperse that $80 billion among American families, which I can't do quick math. It's not clear to me that that's enough to pay for them to now go to a private institution, which is, I think, what the idea would be. But never mind. By contrast, many of the people on that stage, specifically Mike Pence, I don't want to misattribute here, but specifically Mike Pence, advocated for extending the Trump tax cuts, which would have the effect of, I think, Jeff Stein's accounting, he's an economic reporter over at the Wall Street Journal, was $2.5 trillion a year of cost. So it feels like this incredible bait and switch where they're talking about how amazing it is for America to make it in America, which, by the way, is increasingly untrue. Socioeconomic status in the U.S. is harder to change now than any time in the past 150 years, according to a recent study from Penn today. You don't have a conversation about how to improve reading scores. You don't have a conversation about the root causes of people not succeeding academically. You don't have a conversation about how to make college or trade school affordable for those who want to go and take advantage of those kinds of things. The only prescription is to cancel the Department of Education. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.